Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. You're very kind. And welcome to the Spanish Court. What a beautiful building, isn't it? It's being redeveloped right now, as you can see, so be careful when you step outside, but it's a fabulous hall, and we're so pleased that you're here to join us today to kick off NATO this year, one of the kickoffs of NATO, for a fantastic discussion that we're really pleased to be hosting in partnership with the Nest Center. More on that in a moment. Rebuilding of the Russian army, challenges, constraints, and implications for NATO. Incredibly important topic. And just to frame it, and I think you know this all because that's what drew you here today, this topic, Russia has basically been unable to exploit its huge economic and human capital, military advantage, and superiority in troops and equipment in the war that it's waging in Ukraine. It has been stymied by the ingenuity and resilience of the Ukrainian defense forces, but also by changing battlefield strategy, technology, and tools. And what we see is that they've been relying on China for military industry, for North Korea, for ammunition, for soldiers as well, and until recently, Iran for drones. Not as much of a partner now for Russia, of course. And while we hope all war ends, and especially the war in Ukraine, and some kind of de-escalation, truce, peace agreement is always being talked about, so we hope it's reached soon. And we wish the same for all the conflicts around the world. Even if this comes true, Russia is anticipated to embark on a comprehensive rebuilding of its military capability. And in fact, this process has already begun. So what we would like to do is answer a few key questions around that tonight as Russia prepares for what it sees as an inevitable and coming conflict with the West. What will happen? And what sort of army will emerge? Will Russia continue to be able to devote the same large share of GDP to military spending that it is doing right now in its wartime economy? Will Russia society continue to support this effort and this policy of confrontation with the West? And what are the implications for the discussions going on these next couple of days for NATO itself and their national security planning? So we're very excited that you've joined us today to embark on this conversation, these series of conversations that we're going to have. And I first of all want to give a huge thank you to the new Eurasian Strategy Center. It's fabulous pulling together this program with them. They have done a tremendous amount of work on this very topic, and you'll see a QR code that you're probably holding in your hand if you're not sitting on it already, that has a link to great research that they've done, different aspects, economic, military, societal, of the Russian army rebuild. So please do click through and take a look at that. And I think 3 out of the 4 contributing writers of that research will be joining us for discussions later on this evening. So you'll be able to hear from them in the flesh in addition to reading about it. You flip that over and you'll see a subscription QR code for Foreign Policy. I know you're all here because you're Foreign Policy subscribers and dedicated readers, but for the few of you that aren't, please do click through and subscribe. By the way, we have some in addition to unbelievably fantastic content, which all year long, all day long. We have a great series of essays that have just dropped about NATO, a compendium from 9 leading thinkers on what needs to happen at this week's summit. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, people like that contributing. So I know you'll find value in it. And you'll know that we have fantastic journalists. You're going to hear from one in a moment, Ravi Agrawal, our editor-in-chief, in conversation. So it's really worth subscribing to. Furthermore, a reception will follow this. So please do stick around. Lovely gardens and grounds here, and it's a beautiful night. So after you feed your head with interesting content, you'll be able to wash it down with a fine drink and some hors d'oeuvres as well. So we hope you stick around for that. So with that, let's kick off and begin our program.
Please welcome to the stage Dutch Minister of Justice and Security, David Van Weel, for a conversation with Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief, Ravi Agrawal.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all of you, for being here. As you just heard, I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and thank you for making time to come here. I know you all have busy schedules. Minister von Wiel, first of all, I just want to say thank you for making it safe for us to be here. I can only imagine the months and months and months of planning that's gone into having us here.
Yeah, the weather was the hardest part, but we managed to do that as well.
Well, thank you. So let's dive right in. I'm curious, we kind of all know that the big thing this week is 5% of spending, the 3.5% plus 1.5%. One of the things I'm curious about is what it does to domestic economies. So how do you go from making a commitment here to actually getting it through at home, and not having your government be upended?
So if you would have asked me 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, if we would make the 2% pledge that was concluded in Wales as the Netherlands, I would have said no way. That was the reality, actually, that although we had our wake-up calls after Georgia, Crimea, specifically as the Netherlands, we had an experience with the Malaysian Airlines flight that was shot down over eastern Ukraine in 2014, which was really a geopolitical wake-up call. Even then, the willingness to increase defense spending was really, really low. So,
and you're at 2% right now, is that right?
Coming up to 2% in 2024 was magical. And now getting an agreement within a matter of months on increasing further to 3.5% hard defense spending and having a 85% majority in parliament from left to right agreeing on this is huge.
Where's that money going to come from?
Well, that's a more difficult question.
That's what I'm here for.
So basically, this is only the start. As leaders conclude, after that, they will need to find a credible path to move towards this 3.5%. And we do notice that having almost doubled our defense budget over the past years, that finding sensible ways to spend this money is not that easy. What you want to avoid is that with the military-industrial complex not scaling up at the speed that we would like it to, is that all you get with more money is higher prices. So I think the big challenge for us is now to diversify, to consolidate, and to make sure that we actually find a credible and efficient spending pathway.
So I want to come to all of that. And for those of you who don't know, the minister, obviously that's one of the hats he wears. He's actually holding two portfolios in the Dutch government right now. But previously, another hat he wore was as Assistant Secretary General at NATO, where his portfolio included innovation and cyber and hybrid. I'm going to come to all of that in a minute. I want to stick with the politics for one more minute. If you're sitting outside of Europe, two things are apparent. One is that there are real political costs to just saying we're going to up defense spending. And with all due respect, your government has fallen. The other thing is that if you're sitting in Asia or you're sitting in America, and you take a broader span of history, you could make the case, and some have made this case, that Europe is on an 80-year holiday where it built a welfare state by outsourcing security to America, trade to China, energy to Russia, and now everything is being upended. And, the people may not want to go along with all of the things that you want to do.
Well, it's certainly difficult. And it's rightly, as you say, it's not only about rebuilding defense, it's about rebuilding resilience in our societies. It's about rebuilding our infrastructure. There is not a bridge in the Netherlands that can actually hold a tank, which is quite shocking. It's about rebuilding the self-reliance of our people. We've seen a big power outage in Spain and Portugal, 12 hours without power, and the price of a small vaccine candle went up to 60 euros.
So the 1.5% would include those kinds of things?
Absolutely, but the mindset is the most important. And I remember shortly after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine that we were most surprised at the resilience that the people of Ukraine showed. They didn't fall for the deep fake saying that Zelensky had left. They endured the power outages, the shooting. They saved themselves, basically, in holding up the trust in their government. And they still do up to this day under a full-scale war. So my challenge would not be just to get the support for the financial means that we need to rebuild, but how do we create that mindset that we are able to actually fight for our country, fight for our democracy, keep our economy going in a world where we basically took a break from geopolitics, you're right.
So this is so relevant right now. Try and just push us towards an answer here on, say, the Dutch government, because again, outsiders looking in, you see the rise of far-right populists in country after country after country, especially when they are Eurocentric, especially when they're taking the kinds of measures that you're describing. So it's very easy for someone like a Geert Wilders to come in and say, this is all wrong, vote for me and I'll make it go away. How do you convince people otherwise?
We have to realize first that the diagnosis that they set is actually relevant to a lot of people and to a lot of voters. So the frustration that people in the Netherlands, for example, have with an issue like migration is real. That frustration is real, and a large part of the problems that he diagnoses are real. It's a second thing to then also have the answers. And what we've seen now in our government is they don't have the answers. Maybe they don't even want the answers. They want the problems to exist because it's their business model. So how do you make sure that you are relevant to these voters as moderate, constructive parties? I think is to share the diagnosis, but to offer real solutions. And the challenge is that these real solutions, they will take time and sacrifice to get there. Because we live in a functional democracy where we cannot change laws overnight. That needs a parliamentary process, that needs due diligence, that needs a judicial system. So it's a challenge. And I can't say that we succeeded right. Because our government has indeed fallen. I would say the success is the success of this. Sorry for that. The preparations. Preparations have taken a bit of a toll, but I'll manage through these few days, I promise. I do think we managed to show that once you take these populists into government and into power, that actually their rhetoric becomes more harmless. And people see that everything they promise, they cannot deliver overnight.
Interesting.
And I think that's part of the reason that he left and ran off, is because he was seeing that this was detrimenting his voter base. He couldn't deliver, just as normal people couldn't deliver at the speed of what they expected.
Minister, I'm going to give you a chance to have a sip of water while I ask you another question. So if you put on your other hat, the former NATO hat, I'm curious now, as all of this money comes online, as countries begin to spend more on their respective defense, what is the best way to use it? Because it's one thing to just have money, and it's another thing, it can easily get lost in a defense industrial complex, sometimes corruption, allocations that aren't smart. What is the smart way for NATO to be prepared?
That's a big question. I'm glad I'm not fully responsible for that anymore. But my theory was always that the defense market is not a market. Because an industrial complex with only one buyer, namely the government, will never have built-in enticements for the kind of innovation or efficiency that we see in a market like mobile phones, for example. Because you can build a fighter jet today, and as long as you don't build a new one and just wait for the government to give you the order to build a new one, which you then build at a cost-plus model, why would you do anything? So what we see now in Ukraine is that all of a sudden, there is a need for the quick delivery of new capabilities in order to defend a nation, in order to balance out a huge difference in manpower and firepower that the Ukrainians are having. And they're doing a fantastic job. I mean, they're developing drones on a monthly basis. But then if you ask here, how many drones do we have in the Dutch Armed Forces? I think it's under 10.
Really?
So still, not being under that pressure, all of a sudden we think that just having the legacy equipment, buying it from the same defense industrial base will make do. And it won't. So we need to find a way to make more flexible the way we spend our money, the procurement processes that we have. We need to take the military out of the driving seat in deciding what kind of equipment we need. We don't ask doctors to develop an MRI machine. If we would have done that, we would have probably never had one. So we would have had better X-rays, for example.
Right.
So to have this groundbreaking innovation, you need to have a different mindset into what does defense of tomorrow look like. And I think we're still lacking effort there. And I think a lot of that money is still going into our traditional defense companies, which is incremental innovation, but it's not groundbreaking. It won't make the real difference.
How much of this mindset change, when you look at hurdles, how much of the mindset problem is among politicians like yourself and your colleagues and among the people? Because again, it strikes me that one of the sort of disadvantages maybe of democracy is that the minute you impose some pain on people, they revolt. Whereas in Russia, Putin can impose a lot of pain on people and he's allowed to do so, or at least repression allows him to do so.
So I think I prefer our system, by the way.
Me too.
Put that up
Me
front.
too. But it has its flaws, and and here we are having a tough discussion, and your government has fallen. I mean, it's hard.
Now, the challenge on our side, I would say, is how do you get the buy-in? How do you sell the mission that we have to the people? And there I have a very simple initiative that I took when I came into office, and that is to ask people to buy emergency packages to last themselves for 48 hours. More recently, we've increased it to 72 hours because my Swedish and Finnish colleagues laughed at me with the 48 hours of resilience, saying you could last hanging upside in the snow under a tree for 48 hours without anything. So we went to 72 hours and then monitoring whether or not people are buying into this. And at first, I would be laughed at in talk shows. And people would say, well, that's crazy. And what's in the box? They would have it on the table. Be laughing at the fact that there's a soul in the package. And what are you going to do? Cut down the neighbor's trees? And I was like, yeah. Actually, if you want to keep warm and we don't have any electricity or gas, probably that's what you want to do with the soul that's in there. And how are you going to cook? And slowly over time, we're seeing that we're now up to 40% of the people that actually have one of these packages in the house. Now, I don't really care about people having packages in the house because most likely you will last, if you need to, on what you have in your house anyway for 72 hours. But the fact that it brings a awareness into people's minds, thinking about, hey, how about grandmother that's in the apartment block on the 9th floor and can't get down because there's no elevator? How do we get into contact with people, our children that are studying at university?
So I like this a lot, but again, the question is, how do you do that and stay in power? I mean, this reminds me of Jean-Claude Juncker's great line, we all know what to do, but if we did it, we wouldn't get elected.
It's a slow process of creating that buy-in. And this has been a fine balance in not being too alarmist, which sometimes from the military or the NATO perspective, the gap can be large towards a population that is not used to conflict or direct threats, like here in the Netherlands, which is different from the Baltic nations or Finland or Sweden, who've been more exposed to that danger over the past 80 years. So it's not creating panic, but creating action. And that's by providing people a perspective. What can they do? So the emergency packages is something that everyone can do. You can step out tonight and you can buy one, pose one. You can think about a plan. What are you going to do with your family members if something should arise? Creating perspective for people, I think that gets them into action. And as a government, it's not only about imposing or doing everything ourselves. And there I take an analogy from the cyber developments that we've seen over the past 15 years. 15 years ago, we thought the internet would only bring us good stuff. That was the idea. And then all of a sudden, we saw that the criminals thought that internet brought us pretty good stuff as well. And they started attacking us. And at first, companies were hiding the fact that they were being attacked, or they were pointing towards the government. What are you going to do to keep the internet safe? Now, over time, we've come to a balance where every company knows it needs to invest in cybersecurity because it's part of what you do as a company is keep your network and your data safe. That's not up to the government to buy for your antivirus software or your firewalls, etc. That's what companies do. As a government, we can provide regulations and we can prosecute or persecute those that act against the laws and the rules that we've come to agree on together. Now, that analogy on how we've come to a shared responsibility model for everything in our daily lives, from increasing resilience in your supply chains, from increasing cybersecurity in vital networks, from security by design. If you build an apartment building, where can people shelter in case of emergencies? I think that's a way where I think in a democracy, you can really mobilize the whole of society, public, private, and government, to get to a high level.
Certainly in the long term, it's hard to argue against that. Minister von Wiel, thank you very much. And thanks again for bringing us here and keeping us safe.
I'll do my best.
Please now welcome to the stage New Eurasian Strategy Center Senior Research Fellow and Head of Economics, Dr. Sergey Aleksashenko, former UK Defense Attaché to Moscow and Kyiv, and Nest Center Associate Fellow, John Foreman, and Nest Center Senior Research Fellow and Head of Sociology, Dr. Ella Paneyakh, for a conversation with FP National Security reporter John Haltiwanger.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I arrived a couple of hours ago, so I'm very excited to hit the ground running despite being extremely jet lagged at the moment. So thank you all for being here with me for this very exciting conversation. Obviously, the big topic of conversation surrounding this week in many ways is Iran and how this emerging conflict that we're seeing between Israel and Iran, and now the US and Iran, might impact Russia, particularly given its reliance on Iran throughout this conflict. But as we noted earlier, Russia has in many ways moved away from its reliance on Iran. But I am curious, John, just to start off, are you expecting Russia to get directly involved in this conflict on any level? Just to get this big topic out of the way to start things off.
Yeah, I don't think Russia will see it. We've signalled throughout since the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel, it doesn't get directly in the area. I think it seems position strategically weakened. So we saw the Syrian Assad regime Russia didn't get involved. I don't think Russia wants to see itself between Israel and the United States on one hand and Iran on the other. So I think Mark Galeotti said there's an opportunity for Russia here in terms of oil pricing, in terms of post-conflict reconstruction. That's actually a mediator. Here's a challenge to Russia, given the strategic position.
What impact do you think this emerging conflict will have overall in terms of Russia's capabilities, in terms of how it's approaching the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think you said 2 years ago it happened then in the Russian position. Particularly to industrial operation and drones, which is significantly weakened. I think after 2023, when they started getting the inflow of Ukrainians, there was a conscious decision by the Russians to relocate production in some Russia itself. So now you're seeing 2,700 drones here. I'm sorry, 2,700 drones equal to Russia's got huge capacity for manufacturing. I think it still relies on Korea. We've been there 2 or 3 times in the last few months. I think it's all relying on China to dual use production, perhaps China pressing the edge. But I think reliance on Iran builds only ever a marriage convenience.
In the meantime, Sergey, speaking of Russia's defensive capabilities and its reliance on other countries throughout this war, what are the implications for Russia's reconstitution of its military, given its heavy reliance on other countries throughout this war, like China, like North Korea, like Iran? Will this continue to have implications for Russia's military moving forward, even perhaps after a ceasefire?
No, I would not overestimate Russian reliance on other countries because Russia relies mostly on its Soviet potential, potential to build Soviet-style, maybe post-Soviet-style weapons. Yes, I will disclose you a secret. In 2012, so 13 years ago, I was a member of the board of Russian United Aircraft Corporation. This is a state-owned corporation that builds all planes. And there was a strategic discussion of the board, the plan for the next 10 years. So I was an independent researcher, no access to classified information, nothing to military, just general figures. And I listened what was allowed to me, and finally asked, look, and what about drones? What? Drones? It's not planes, it's computers. We don't care with planes. So thank you, the government. The government didn't listen to me and did not start produce drones. So in the beginning of Ukrainian war, Russia purchased Iranian drones and technology. And nowadays, Russia produces itself. So there is no reliance on Iran anymore. On North Korea, soldiers, 10,000 soldiers were in Ukraine. They left. So all who survived, we don't know how many. And China, yes, China supplies machinery, generally for Russian industry. Let's say 80% of machinery building tools nowadays are imported from China, but it's not direct of military use. So I would not overestimate overall Russian reliance on other countries. So Russia is still with the Soviet model of the army, and it will survive, because in this war, Russian army did not learn any other lessons. So yes, it's a war, manpower, firepower, tanks, artillery, yes, drones, okay, we start to produce them. That's it.
Can Russia sustain its current level of military spending, and how have military expenditures impacted other sectors of the Russian economy?
It's one more overestimation of how costly the war for Russia is. Russian Ministry of Finance and CPRI, Stockholm Institute, they gave the same number, the increase in military expenditures pre-war to the current level. It's about 3% of GDP. Out of this 3% of GDP, 40 to 50% means 1.2, 1.5%. It's payments to households. It's to the servicemen and to the members of the family. So for the budget, for the economy, it doesn't matter. Either you pay teachers, doctors, or pensioners, or servicemen. It's just you collect taxes and you pay to households. So we call them military. Yeah, but in fact, from the macroeconomic viewpoint, it's not military. Yeah, it's just transfers to households. So all in all, the increase in military expenditures in purchase of arms, armament, ammunition, and all current expenditures, food supply, fuel, I don't know, logistics, it's 1.5, 1.7% of GDP. Is it a lot? No. Can Russia sustain another 5 years? Yes, of course. 10 years, no problem. So it's not as heavy as you can imagine.
Feel free to hop in.
No, I was going to say, if you can hear me now, is there have been cuts to other parts of the federal budget in terms of education and transport infrastructure. So I think Putin has been mortgaging the future to pay for his war now. I agree that the current level of spending is sustainable. And of course, Putin's been signaling himself that he doesn't want to go run away arms race in the United States. So there's like a degree of caution. So I've never been one who agrees with the strapline that Russia has been fully mobilized or that Russia is on a war economy, because I think those are inaccurate. And actually, as Sergey's been saying, it's much more carefully managed and balanced, notwithstanding some of the moaning by people at the conference in St. Petersburg last week.
And anyone can take this next question. What would you say are the biggest current economic challenges for Russia related to the war?
The biggest challenge is inflation, because Russia used extensive financial reserves that were accumulated before the war. Russia transferred about 2.5 million people, workers, from civilian industry to military production. So Russia sent 700,000 to 800,000 from industry, from the economy, to the front line. Another 500,000 to 700,000 left Russia. So it's shortage of labor, increase of wages, inflation as a result. Yeah, and to fight inflation, central bank increased its key rate, while we understand that if inflation is generated by military expenditures, by expenditures on the war, key rate of the central bank doesn't play any role. Nevertheless, the rate is 21%, 20% currently, and the civilian sector is declining. So it's a recession in the civil sector of the economy. So this combination of labor shortage, inflation, and recession is the major challenge.
So you're saying there already is a recession. I know there is a concern. Your Russian economy minister expressed concerns last week that Russia's on the brink of recession. Is this happening? Is it going to happen?
It seems it's happening. It seems it's happening, yeah, because the military production is enormously classified data, so we cannot measure it. We have to trust the statistical agency, but seems it's a recession.
Ella, I want to move over to you. I'm wondering how the Russian public is responding to the war at this point. Are you still seeing a lot of support from the Russian public? Can we even accurately measure support for the war at this stage? Can we trust any of the polling?
Well, of course, polling is one of the last things you can trust in the country that is deeply authoritarian and ended war. But there is other data, sociological, and some data that can be sociologically interpreted, although like collected in different ways. I think there is a relative minority of population who actually support the war effort as such, because people have imperial nostalgia, because people have this genuine militaristic drive in them. It's probably maybe 20 or 25%. But there is another big part of population that tries to kind of not see the war, that is neutral to the war. They think that, okay, government has a right to do it. We are not angry at government for doing it, but it's not like our thing. But many of them are quite happy with the change that comes with the war into their civic life in Russia. The fact that, as Sergey said already, the industry gets money, the industrial workers and technical personnel are getting paid better. The industrial cities that used to be in depressive state during the whole post-Soviet era, more than 30 years, are now, relatively thriving, and capitals are relatively going down, which kind of makes at least relative deprivation of ordinary people smaller. They really live a little bit better, but they also do not see that those who thrived before, which they thought is not very just, frankly, now are not feeling that well. So people are kind of, there is a much bigger chunk of population that are happy with the changing way of life within Russia. And then, because of this, kind of, they don't support the war, but they're kind of fine with it.
Obviously, it's very up in the air whether or not there will be a ceasefire, despite efforts from the Trump administration and others. Peace does not seem to be close, unfortunately. But if it does happen, I can imagine there'll be a number of challenges in Russian society. Reintegrating soldiers returning home. Yeah. What kind of challenges are you looking out for in such an instance, and how will this pose obstacles to Russia's efforts to reconstitute its military?
Well, I think most of the people are going to be happy at first, especially if there will be something that Putin at least somehow can sell as a victory to the population, not as a defeat, at least. But then there are going to be lots of tensions and the biggest tension is going to be between people who are back from the front and people who got better off because of the war without fighting. Russian army now mostly consists of people who are not only paid for fighting, sums that they never would have made otherwise, but also who are organizing themselves into fighting units, practically on their own. They're more mercenaries than professional contract soldiers. So one would expect them, to not want to lose their position, to not want to lose their income. I cannot imagine them getting back and getting, to work at the factory. And the rest of society doesn't like them because they're getting paid for fighting. People are not grateful for them for fighting. And people are mostly afraid of them and expect them to be criminal even before they came back in numbers that can actually affect the actual level of violent crime.
Feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I think, I think we're already seeing that. We've already seen that process over the last 3 years. Increase in alcoholism, increase in violence, murders, increase in domestic violence, which is, I think, a key indicator of an unhappy society. So I think you're right. There's going to be a huge challenge. These older men with PTSD and or wounded being rehabilitated or whatever into society. At the same time, the Russian military is going to have to then be rebuilt, presumably younger people. And where are these people going to come from? Who wants to? If the bonuses aren't on the line there to sign up, you just become a conscript or a person in the ranks. Why join? So I think they've got two societal problems and also a military challenge as well.
I can imagine they've also lost a lot of experienced personnel, experienced leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Russians themselves and experts have identified, the junior officers in particular have been absolutely slaughtered. So what's happened is that all the junior officers who were in the professional Russian army of 2022, the day before the invasion, have gone. And now you'll have people who have been brought up from the ranks who are used to fighting that battle. They've been fighting in the Donbass. But they're not perhaps the right people you want to be reconstituting your quote-unquote new model army after the war's finished. And also the other problem is that the tactics they're using on the front line now are very, very hyper-specialized for that fight. They're not necessarily the skills you need to be fronting NATO or to do combined arms warfare, which is what the Russian army was for. So they've got this real problem, how they rebuild the professional officer corps, especially junior and mid-ranking officers who are the ones to provide the leadership, in an army which doesn't have an NCO cadre, which was normally in the British American model, NCOs are the sort of reservoir of knowledge of the army, and they don't exist. So they've got massive challenges there as well.
The British Ministry of Defense recently estimated that Russia has already suffered over 1 million casualties in this war. Obviously, massive losses. And as far back as late 2022, we saw numerous headlines about how the military Russia had spent years building was effectively destroyed, and it would, of course, have to rebuild. And we've seen numerous takes from Western experts and analysts over the time since about how it will do this. But what are we actually hearing from Russians themselves about what they're doing to reconstitute the military?
I'll take this first. I think there's been lots of focus in the West about kit. So how many tanks can Russia produce? How many Russian tanks do they need? Therefore, that takes 5 years or 10 years. And I think, as Dara Masakot said, we actually need to think about what the Russians talk about, the shape of their armed forces. So they've taken some decisions about enlargement, great, but what sort of army do they want? And I think the expert opinion I've read in Russia is that that's still under discussion. So because Putin's quite cautious, we don't know how the war's going to finish, so we don't know the state of the Russian army before it needs to start that reconstitution journey. It's making their task very difficult because they're absolutely bogged down in the war, and they have to then reprioritize themselves for, quote, a war against NATO, perhaps in the future. So I think you'll probably see an evolutionary approach. You won't see massive plans coming out. You'll see the thing, the shape will emerge. And even the new equipment program, which was announced last week, is pretty evolutionary. It's nothing radical in there. So I think what I'm thinking, and what Russians are saying, like Alexander Goltz, is really a modification of the existing army. It's not a massive modernization process. Along the shape of the Russian army as it was before in the Soviet period and in the Russian imperial period. So it's not going to be making a qualitative leap towards a, quote, Western-style model.
Sergey, even if there is a ceasefire, and again, it continues to be a big if, I can imagine that at least some Western sanctions will remain, despite Putin's demands for all of the sanctions to be lifted. What challenges will these pose for the Russian economy, particularly as it continues to take steps to rebuild the military?
The biggest problem for the Russian economy is its dependence on Western technology, on Western equipment, on Western industrial units. Because if we look historically, since the end of the 19th century, all major Russian Soviet enterprises, they were built based on purchased imported equipment, purchased technologies, very often with the assistance of American, German, Italian businessmen, engineers, and so on. So today, during the war, Russia has exhausted all its existing potential, even not military, in non-military production, and according to the central bank statistics, it's on the level about 80%. So it's overused capacity, industrial capacity. So if and when the war stops, if and when ceasefire starts, the problem for the Russian economy will be to increase production. But to increase production, you need new equipment. You need new industrial facilities. To build new industrial facilities, you need to open trade with the West, to make non-friendly countries, to make them friendly. But I'm not sure the West is ready. China is very reluctant to provide Russia some pieces of technology. Yes, equipment, machine tools, it's not a problem. But China doesn't want Russia to become competitor to China. So China doesn't want Russia to produce the same type of goods, of non-military civilian, same type of the cars or refrigerators and so on. Okay, purchase them from China. And that will be the major challenge. That will be the major challenge. After the war, Russian economy, a lot of, even on this St. Petersburg Economic Forum that took place last week, all Russian economic ministers and Putin himself said, we need new economic model. Dreaming about after war, but there is no growth without investment. And the chairman of Sberbank, the biggest Russian bank, said there is no demand for investment credit. So nobody is able to purchase any equipment. So that is the major challenge.
Can you talk about how Putin's love for judo shapes his approach to the wartime economy, to power, to this war, and how it helps him, shape his view of playing the long game?
Yeah, it happened somewhere in the middle of 2022. And Putin is a judo master. He's really good in judo. He's really good. He's not a chess player. He's not a soccer player, a football player. He's a judo master. And in judo master, after his blitzkrieg failed, that he launched in February 2022, somewhere by the mid-2022, there was a question for him what to do further on, after Ukraine denied to sign Istanbul agreements. And he said, okay, let's use judo practice. I am judo master with a mass of 85 kilos, and Ukraine is a judo master with weight of 55 kilos. What's the outcome? It's the war of attrition. And that is what we see today. And that was his message sent last week. Saying, okay, any further day, okay, you can resist. But you are 55, I'm 85. I'm ready. I'm ready to be with you. But every next moment, every next minute, you will be weaker, weaker, and weaker. So that's his approach. He's not, and that's why, and that is, I believe that his intentional position not to over-increase military expenditures. Let's keep it on the same level. Let's keep army of 750,000 servicemen. Let's keep military production on the current level. We don't need more. 55 against 85.
and this is a question for the group, but what are the biggest challenges for NATO moving forward as Russia moves to reconstitute its military? And are there any areas or vulnerabilities for Russia that you think the alliance needs to take a step forward in terms of exploiting?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we look at the shape of the Russian armed forces in the future, I think it's actually going to be a strategically defensive force. I think what we've seen, if we go back towards the sort of Soviet model, is a fairly defensive organization, defensively minded. But of course, I think that for us, the biggest challenge, if you look at not taking off the strategic nuclear weapons off the table, it is Russia's ability to project force through nuclear and conventional missiles to hold targets in Europe at risk. And I think that's the biggest gap we've got. Because actually, in terms of numbers, in terms of defense spending, in terms of 3.5, 1.5, actually, we can, on conventional side, we can maintain conventional deterrence, but I'm concerned that we have neglected medium-range missiles, both nuclear and conventional, in Europe since the end of the Cold War, and certainly since the demise of the INF, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges we're going to have. Having said that, because I think people talk about tactical nuclear weapons, but I think our emphasis is on deterring attack in the first place, not trying to deal with the consequences of any attack should it come about in the future. So more deterrence, less defense.
Do you think that the West and NATO more generally have learned the correct lessons about this war so far in terms of the challenges presented by Russia, the nature of the threat presented by Russia?
Well, I think there's been massive over gloom and over optimism. And I think the problem we've got, we lack understanding of the Russian military, detailed knowledge. As somebody said, we've had 30 years of relative peace in Europe, where we took our eye off Russia completely. 2014 comes about, we all go, where's the experts on Russia? Well, they've all gone. They're now experts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in shape at the time, and we looked around, there was no expertise at all. I was the Ukraine guy because I'd served there. So I think we're still a long way to do to rebuild those core skills, not just on language, but in terms of really understanding the Russian military psyche, not just on equipment, which people focus on, but on their concepts and how they fight, and also their people, and then to try and gain competitive advantages like that. I see that happening, but I think it's taken a rather long time. We have a wake-up call, we keep waking up. Finally, I'm hoping this time we're actually going to finally wake up, put our money where our mouth is, invest in understanding, as well as talking to the bloody Russians military at some stage and actually opening up channels for dialogue and discussion.
Speaking of the Russian psyche, I'd like to ask you, Ella, how is this war reshaping Russian psychology? It has to be pretty shocking, I would imagine, for Russians to see something like the Kursk offensive, Ukraine actually occupying Russian territory, or the recent Operation Spider's Web. How are incidents like this, operations like this, shaping Russian psychology and views of the war and views of the military?
Well, I'm afraid these episodes shake Russians much less than a European would imagine. And the reason is the atomization of Russian society. Russian society used to be incredibly atomized in early post-Soviet period because Soviet government was responsible for much more different layers, for much more different worlds of social life in Soviet Russia. And when the Soviet government got dismissed, you see the society that is not only doesn't know how to do like capitalist economy, they also do not know how to deal with the religion because they're raised non-religious, how to deal with their house, how to deal with organization of work, everything. So it's a really, really atomized society that started like growing the social fabric back after the initial period of post-Soviet collapse. And the Russian society was busy doing it practically until 2020. But with the war, Lots and lots of social capital has been destroyed consciously by the government, trying to reduce society to no dissent, to no voice, but also just because people immigrated, just because people got frightened by mobilization. Actually, the event that had shaken Russian society more than all you mentioned was involuntary mobilization in late 2022. So people really care about what's going on with their fellow Russians outside their small communities, the local communities, much less than one can imagine.
I think we need to wrap up here, but I know earlier we were having technical difficulties when I asked you about the topic of the day on Iran. If you could quickly summarize whether or not you think this will impact how Russia is approaching the war in Ukraine and whether or not Russia will get involved in this emerging conflict with Iran between Israel and the United States.
So on the war, no, I think Russia sees opportunity because, as happened after the Hamas attacks, the whole world attention went on to the Middle East and went off the issue of Ukraine. So Ukrainian cities have been bombed nightly now with hundreds of drones, and it barely features on the news. So it's bad. I think you're right about the production, so dependencies, and also they might see an opportunity to say to Trump, hey, let's sort out the Ukraine issue. You need to focus on Iran. So no, I don't see that. I think, secondly, I don't think on Russian direct involvement at all. I think Russia signaled for a number of years now it doesn't want to go down that path for a number of reasons. As I said, not to get between the United States and Iran, and it's not in their interest. Ultimately, there was no crink. Iran didn't matter to Russia the same way as people thought it did.
Well, thank you all. I think I speak for everyone here saying this was a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage New Eurasian Strategy Center Senior Research Fellow and Head of International Partnership, John Luff, for a conversation with FP's Andrew Solinger.
Thank you. Well, John, that was a really interesting conversation with your colleagues, understanding a little bit more about the dynamics of Russia from a sociological perspective, an economic perspective, how that links with the West. I would love to talk through a little bit of the highlights, what your takeaways were from today's discussion, including what we heard from Minister Van Viel when Ravi Agrawal was interviewing him earlier. But first, I wanted to focus on NEST, the NEST Center, and understand a little bit more about what the NEST Center is trying to achieve, why it was created, and your role as you focus on international. Of course, NEST does two things, as you described to me: focus on domestic issues within Russia, and then international issues as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on why NEST, the reason for NEST's existence, and what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. I think I'll start with the fact that I'm a Russia expert by background, and I started my career in 1989, so just as the Cold War was starting to come to an end. And in the West at the time, we had a great deal of expertise. These were Sovietologists, people who've been studying the country for decades. And it was really quite impressive in scale across almost all NATO countries at the time. And of course, in places like Sweden and Finland, it was really in pretty good shape. We have lost an immense amount of that over the last 30 years. And as I think John Foreman was explaining,
was just mentioning that,
the focus was elsewhere. So you went off to learn Dari or Farsi or whatever it was at the time. And we discovered it was a pretty brutal awakening in 2014. We'd thrown this away. So that's actually very difficult to recreate. And we have an opportunity, and I think Nest Center is trying to make use of this opportunity. It is to bring high-quality Russian expertise into the Western discussion. So we have access to these great resources, and my colleagues Ella and Sergey are perfect examples of that. We have this great wisdom and understanding of the way Russia works, that we can exploit that and we can bring it into the Western debate. We can help informing governments and decision makers about how this Russian system ticks, how Russia is responding to these various things that are going on in the world, not just externally, but I think very subtly, as Ella was explaining, internally. There's a great deal going on which is actually not visible to the naked eye unless you're really studying this in detail.
And Ella was very clear in pointing out that we should not believe the polling or look to that as any kind of indicator of what common thought is. But I'd love to share my impressions of the discussion and takeaways, and then and get yours specifically on what we were talking about today. I was a little taken aback by Sergey's really very confident expression of the fact that Russia is actually not in great shape economically, but at the level of investment and the level of dedication right now to the military endeavor that it is undertaking in the war in Ukraine, it is quite capable of maintaining that the coming year, few years, 10 years, I believe you said. So that to me was very eye-opening and somewhat disturbing. Speaking to the fact that what Ella was talking about around the sociology of and the thinking of the Russian population, yeah, there's 20-25% that are either militarist or yearning for old Soviet-style empire, but there's a large chunk of the population, and then there's an equally, I don't think you gave us a percentage, but a small population that is very silently but virulently against this conflict. But the largest share of the population is not happy, but quite content to not make waves. They are content and happy with the bargain that is improving some level of economic activity around manufacturing and the like, and that's helpful for them. And then, of course, John, you were talking a little bit about what the West's reaction here is, and and how that I'm a little more encouraged by the fact that military endeavor to change and transform the military has not been so dynamic as one might think, considering what has happened elsewhere in the world. How did I do on that summary? First of all,
you did pretty well. I'm not going to shoot anything down,
and that's concerning. Is something that I would pass on. I welcome your reflections on it.
Well, I think Russia can certainly go on fighting for a long time. And it has the resources to do that, both economic and human. The fact that Russians still recruit 1,300 men a day to go into the meat grinder in Ukraine, tells you something about the condition of society and the readiness of part of society to make that or take that risk and make that sacrifice. I think the question you have to ask yourself, though, is what is this more broadly doing to Russia? And Sergey alluded to the fact that this dependency is building up on China, the fact that the vast majority of machine tools are now coming from there. I saw a statistic today saying that 70% of new cars in Russia now are Chinese. This has a long-term effect on the shape of the country. And if traditionally it has relied on the West as a source of modernization, both technologically and in terms of ideas, importing certain cultural concepts, all these things. We have a relationship with the West which is extremely damaged right now. And it's very difficult to see how that's going to be resurrected in short order. This is going to take a long time. So what is this actually doing to the country overall? John Foreman referred also to the mortgaging of the future when it comes to the investment in education, in social services, medicine, all these things. This is taking a toll. So yes, Russia can last the course, but how does it come out of it? And what does that mean for the overall strength of the country? So I think there's some very, very big questions to be asked. So my view is there will eventually be some sort of reckoning when it comes to measuring the impact of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the decision effectively to go to war with the West. Putin may not speak about it in quite those terms, but effectively Russia has made that choice. So we are, unfortunately, in a pattern now where one can see it probably going on for several years, and looking at the way Western countries are now rearming, to come back to what the Dutch minister was saying, we're getting into our own cycle now, which is in fact going to be difficult to stop because those investments in defense tend to be long-term. That's what allows the investments to be possible. So we are stuck in a very difficult cycle. But through all this, we need to have really good analysis of Russia. One has to be careful with the word, unfortunately, understanding, because of the way Gerhard Schröder and other Germans created this notion of the Russlandversteher. But when I talk about understanding, I mean it is real appreciation of the way the Russian system works, the way the Russian leadership is thinking, what its priorities are, and how it goes about implementing those goals. Those are things we have to understand much better in order to be able to respond to them.
Mm-hmm. And well, we only have 30 seconds left, and we all have drinks and a lovely reception we want to attend to. So we want to end on a positive note. With that better, if we can, with that better understanding, will that aid in negotiations? Will that aid in some type of assessment of that will lead to a peace and a truce? What can we be hopeful for moving forward from this understanding and these discussions?
I think that we can be hopeful, A, that we can, in fact, conduct negotiations better, but secondly, that we're going to be able to contribute to the rebuilding of a relationship from a better knowledge base than we, in fact, had in 1991. Even if we understood a lot about the Soviet Union, we didn't understand quick enough the processes that then took place as the Soviet Union collapsed. So that's why we need to think ahead. And I think this is where an organization such as the Nest Center has an advantage, because they're trying to look into that space of what actually emerges and how do we prepare Western countries, Western governments in particular, for the fact they're going to be dealing with already a very different Russia.
Great. Well, John, thank you for mission accomplished. Thank you for sharing that insight. And thank you for the great work that the Nest Center does, including working with foreign policy on this excellent and very informative forum. Thank you so much. Thank John, please, if you would.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So that's a wrap for us today. I won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for your patience and for listening in on the discussion. We do have a lovely reception planned for you. So please do stay and network and speak with our colleagues at Nest and at Foreign Policy. A couple of quick things. I mentioned the QR code on your chairs. I hope you all subscribed. Please do and read our excellent FP content. We also have quite a few events that we do at FP over the course of the year. My colleagues, Katie Blake and Sophia Vergara, I think is here, also have done fantastic work as well in pulling together this event. We have just finished hosting a roundtable here today on biosecurity, and we're doing roundtables. These are already full private roundtables tomorrow morning and the day after, but we'd be very interested in discussing with you potential partnerships as well. So thanks for joining us, and please do enjoy the drinks.